Köszöntök mindenkit, az a megtiszteltetés élt, hogy én üdvözölhetem, és én mutatom önöknek David Armitage professzort, a angol-amerikai professzorát a Harvard Egyetemnek, aki volt olyan kedves és meglátogatott minket könyve megjelenése alkalmából. Ez a könyv a Polgárháborúk című kötet, egy kiválóan érdekes gondolatébresztő olvasmány. Azt hiszem 20%-os kedvezményét meg lehet kapni, ez volt itt most a reklám helye itt a bejáratnál. Úgy beszéltük meg a tolmácsunkkal, hogy én a professzor be fogom mutatni magyarul. I will introduce you in Hungarian, and after we shall talk in English. And utána a beszélgetés, a párbeszéd természetesen angolul lesz. Ha ez önöknek is megfelel, akkor csináljuk ezt. David Armitage 1965-ben született az angliai Stockportban. A helyi középiskola elvégzése után a Cambridge Egyetem hallgatója lett, ahol a doktori disszertációját Shakespeare ókori forrásairól és a neoklasszikus költészetről akarta megírni. Azt hiszem, ez sokat segített neki, hogy ilyen könyvet volt képes írni, mint amilyet itt most fordítottunk. De kutatásai során érdeklődése egyre inkább az eszmetörténet felé fordult. 2 évet a Princeton Egyetem Institute of Advanced Studies fejlett tanulmányok intézetében végezte. 1992-ben Cambridge-ben védte meg doktori disszertációját, melynek The British Empire and the Civic Tradition, tehát a brit birodalom és a állampolgári hagyomány 1656-1742 volt a címe. 1 évet Cambridge-ben töltött. 11 éven át a Columbia Egyetem történelmi tanszékén tanított, 2004-ben pedig a Harvardra került, és azóta is ennek a professzora. A professzori címmel a történelem tanszék vezetője, és a Társadalomtudományi Fokozatok Bizottságának a vezető személyisége lett. Nemzetközi és regionális tanulmányok Harvard Akadémiájának kutatója, és tanít a Harvard jogi iskolájában, melyel amerikai elnökök életrajzi írása közben sokszor találkoztam. Minden második elnök az Egyesült Államokban a Harvard jogi iskoláját végezte el. Tulajdonképpen valamennyi kontinensen tartott előadásokat, tanulmányutakat tett Ausztráliában, Nagy-Britanniában, Kínában, Franciaországban, Németországban, Dél-Koreában és természetesen az Egyesült Államokban. Tiszteletbeli tagja a Cambridge-i St. Catherine's College-nak, tiszteletbeli professzor a Belfasti Queen's Egyetemnek és a Sydney Egyetemnek. Megkapta a Londoni Tengerészeti Múzeum Caird érdemérmét, remélem jól ejtem ki 2006-ban, a Harvard Egyetem pedig kiváló munkásságáért 2008-ban Walter Channing Cabot Fellow-vá választotta. Majd 2015-ben a Cambridge Egyetem a legmagasabb kitüntetését, ha jól ejtem ki, a Lit D-t adományozta neki. Levelező tagja a madridi Real Academia della Historiának, és külföldi tagja az Academia Europeának, ha jól ejtem ki a nevét, ugye Európát nagyon sokféle módon ejthetjük ki. Tagja a Royal Society of Edinburgh-nak, a Royal Historical Society-nek, és az Australian Academy of the Humanities, tehát az Ausztráliai Bölcsészeti Akadémiának. Nagyon érdekes történt a The History Manifesto, a történelem kiáltványa című könyve, melynek épp arról beszélgetünk, hogy szívesen vállal majd a lefordítását. Ebben a közelmúltban megjelent könyvében felhívta a figyelmet arra a tény, hogy a történettudomány fokozatosan elveszíti jelentőségét korunkban, évtizedeinkben, és több reformintézkedésre tett javaslatot, melyekre a történészek visszaszerezhetnék egykori befolyásukat. Ha mindannyian arra gondolunk, hogy a 19. században milyen tekintélye, jelentősége volt egy új történelmi munkának, hogy nem lehetett olyan 10 kötetes művet írni, amelyet ne olvastak volna el sokan, akár angolul, akár francia, akár németül, akár magyarul, Horváth Mihály művei és mások. És ma hol tart a történettudomány, és milyen köteteket olvasnak, akkor ezt azt hiszem, hogy egyetértéssel fogadjuk. Jelenleg annak köszönhettük a gyors látogatását, hogy a sabbatical évét tölti Berlinben 2022-től 23-ig. Önálló köteteit, felsorolok néhányat, mondom mindjárt a magyar fordítását a címnek, jó, hogy ne kelljen fordítani ezt. Tehát a brit birodalom ideológiai gyökereiről írt könyvet a Cambridge University Pressnél jelent meg 2000-ben. Nagyobb Britannia 1516-1776 címmel esszét tett közzé az atlanti történelemről 2004-ben. A Függetlenség nyilatkozat globális története címmel írt egy könyvet 2007-ben. Modern politikai gondolkodás alapjai címmel, megint a Cambridge University Pressnél 2012-ben, amit említettem, a történelmi kiáltványa, az 2014-ben jelent meg, és ez a könyv, amiről most itt beszélni fogunk, ez a Polgárháborúk című könyve, Civil Wars, a History of Ideas, elnézést, Polgárháborúk az eszmékben élő történelem címmel, ezt adta ki a könyvhétre a Rubicon Intézetünk. Általa szerkesztett kötetek között ilyen széles érdeklődési kört, tanúsító címeket találunk, mint Milton és a republikanizmus, Bolingbroke politikai írásai, birodalmi elméletek 1450-től 1800-ig, a brit atlanti világ 1500-tól 1800-ig, a brit politikai gondolatok a történelemről, irodalomban és elméletekben 1500-1800 között, Shakespeare és a kora újkori politikai gondolkodás, ezek a köteteknek társszerzője, a forradalmak kora globális összefüggésekben 1760-1840, csendes óceáni történetek, óceán, föld és nép, valamint a béke kultúrtörténete a felvilágosodás korában 2020-as kiadványai. Akit érdekel, a sajtóba közétett publikáció, hogy ez a Harvard Egyetemnek a honlapján megtalálható egy link, amelyen ezek olvashatóak. Úgyhogy perhaps this was the introduction, and now let's begin to talk about your excellent book. A könyv engem azért fogott meg, mert ebben excuse me. This book was very interesting for me because in our age, the fashion among historians is to know more and more about smaller and smaller subjects, to know more and more about less and less subjects, and the end to know everything about nothing. So in this age, it's very interesting to read a book about the civil wars, which begins at the beginning of the Roman, not at beginning, in the time of the Roman Republic, in the ancient Roman Republic, and we learn from the book a lot of things, how people used the civil war, which were the different narratives about the civil war, and what was the use in the modern age. In the introduction of your book, you have written this: civil war has gradually become the most widespread, the most destructive, and the most characteristic form of organized human violence. These conflicts are also much more prone to recur than any others, as the more likely legacy of a civil war is another civil war, is further civil war. Indeed, almost every civil war in the last decade was the resumption of an earlier one. It seems that civil war, like the poor, may always be with us. Ours is not a world at peace. It is a world of civil war. The civil war is less studied than interstate war, end of the quotations. So could you tell us, would you please explain us why we remain so confused about civil wars and why we refuse to look it in the face?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the warm introduction, Peter, and thank you also for the opportunity to revisit a country I've not visited for 35 years. And as you can imagine, if you do the mathematics, Hungary and Budapest look very different now than they did when I last visited in 1987. So it's a very great pleasure to be here. To answer your very important question, why are we so confused about civil war and why do we refuse to look it in the face? I think we refuse to look it in the face because it is so ultimately, almost existentially terrifying. As I argue in the book, when we describe a conflict as a civil war, we simultaneously acknowledge our connection with, our community with someone else at exactly the moment when we stare down the barrel of their gun or point a sword at their throat. So to talk about a civil war in the original Roman sense is to talk about a citizens' war, a war among those who recognize themselves to be part of the same community, and that is the fundamental horror of civil war. It is an intimate form of enmity. I think that is the answer to that second part of the question, why it's so hard to look civil war in the face. Why are we so confused about civil war? I think the short answer in a word is history. What is that history? It's the history I try to tell in the book, which is the history of the different languages, the different conceptions, we might say the different ideologies lying behind competing conceptions of civil war, which we speak whenever we use the term civil war. We speak multiple languages without knowing it, and that leads to competition, confusion, and contestation about the application or the non-application of the term civil war to specific concepts, to specific conflicts, for example, Iraq in 2004, or Syria in 2012. And it was from those present-day examples of competition and contestation about whether or not to call those conflicts civil war that my historical study, going back, as you mentioned, over 2,000 years, originally sprang.
Thank you very much. And the other question, almost the same: why did the philosophers call civil war an essential contested concept? But I think in your book you answered. Usually the question is that, can you define the civil war? And the answer is that it's impossible to define something which has history, as Nietzsche told, if I can quote from your book. So we can define only those things which has not history, which hasn't changed along the history. Why were the Romans and not the Greek who created this idea, civil war?
Very good question. I begin the book with the Romans, but I have a very brief excursion explaining why not the Greeks. Surely anyone who has read Thucydides knows that the Greeks had internal conflicts, very bloody and destructive internal conflicts. However, the Greeks do not call them civil wars. Obviously, the Greeks did not speak Latin, but even if we translate into ancient Greek, they did not have an exact equivalent for what the Romans and those after the Romans called a civil war. Why not? Because a civil war, again, as I mentioned briefly, in the original Roman Latin meaning of the term, is a war among fellow cives, that is, citizens. The word civil, like the word civilization or civility, comes from civis, citizen, cives, citizens. A civil war is a war among citizens defined legally and politically. The nearest equivalent for the Greeks defined it as oikaios polemos. That is a war in the household, or we might say more broadly within the family or within the ethnic group. So when the Greeks, meaning mostly the Athenians, spoke about similar forms of conflict, they imagined it, or they constructed it, understood it, within the context of a familial, blood-related, or ethnic conception of the community. When the Romans talked about it, they talked about it in terms of common legal and political status. And so in most European languages, and languages derived from European languages, the term for civil war is literally a civil war among fellow citizens. In Russian, for instance, Гражданская война is a war among citizens. In Japanese, even, drawing on European languages, it's a war among citizens, so that Roman conception is the one that has swept the board and has gone global, not the Greek one.
Thank you very much. In your book, you have written, the boundaries between different types of wars remained debatable. The Roman civil wars generated three kinds of narratives, three kinds of stories, and these kind of narratives could be applied to later sequences of political and military disturbance until well into the 18th century. Could you please explain us shortly these three narratives and the differences between them?
Yes, these are three Roman narratives, again, of civil war. And those narratives I call first. The first one is the Republican narrative of civil war. The second, the imperial narrative of civil war. The third, the Christian narrative of civil war. The first one, the Republican narrative, takes civil war to be the inevitable disease of civilization itself. To live in cities, to have a civilized society, to be part of a civilization at all, is to be prone to internal conflict. This was the ethical and historical lesson of many of the Roman historians. The second narrative, the imperial narrative, had a similar structure but a very different end to it. In that narrative, the narrative of those who defended the Roman emperors and therefore the Roman Empire, the story ended with a cure for that disease of civilization, the cure being monarchy or imperial monarchy, the emperorhood, emperorship. The third narrative, the Christian narrative, took a similar form but imposed a moral narrative, a religious narrative derived from Christianity onto the Roman narrative. This is particularly characteristic, for example, of St. Augustine in his City of God, who portrays the earthly city, the city which has not yet found God, as being subject not to the disease of civil war, but to the sin of civil war. That civil war for Augustine and those who followed him was evidence of humanity's fallen sinfulness, from which human beings could be rescued only by their belief in God, and therefore moving from the city of man to the city of God, a city which, unlike the city of Rome, would not be subject to the disease or the sin of civil war.
Thank you very much. So if I understand well, these three narratives were used in the Middle Ages, during the Middle Ages and in the... Hallani a hangomat? Elnézést. Hosszú nyomtam be valamit? Most jó, ugye? Jó, okay. These three narratives were used in the Middle Ages and mostly in the modern age too. It seems to me that something has changed at the second half of the 18th century. Till the second half of the 18th century, the civil wars were the most terrible events of human history. Think about Shakespeare. Shakespeare dramas about the English kings, where in the battlefield of the Civil War, a father finds the dead body of his son, and the son finds the dead body of his father. So Civil War is everything which is terrible. And this value judgment is not so clear anymore from the 18th century. From that time, I quote you, the victors in a civil war often commemorate their struggle as a revolution. As in the American and French revolutions, it's easy to perform the conjugation, I am a revolutionary, you are a rebel, they are engaged in civil war. This is my favorite quotation from your book. What do you think, why this happened in the second part of the 18th century?
Yes, thank you for that question. So my argument at that point in the book is that in the late 18th century, let's say the era of the age of revolutions, the American and French revolutions and those that follow them, that narrative or that set of narratives I just described of a sequence of civil wars is replaced by another narrative, a narrative many of us still have in our heads, of a sequence not of civil wars but of revolutions. What is the difference between those narratives? Well, there are many differences, but some of the key ones are the narrative of civil wars was always backward-looking and destructive. The narrative of revolutions is forward-looking, future-oriented, and full of liberatory possibility. But as I show in the book, we might think of that narrative of a sequence of revolutions, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, moving forward to the Russian, the Chinese, the Iranian, Cuban revolutions in the 20th century. We might see that narrative of revolutions succeeding each other as like a palimpsest, like a medieval manuscript in which one text is written over the text of an earlier manuscript. In this case, I think that narrative of revolutions, sequential revolutions, is written over that earlier narrative of civil wars or set of narratives of civil wars, with the effect of obscuring the violence which is always at the heart of revolutions themselves. Revolutions, successful revolutions may present themselves as forward-looking, future-oriented and liberatory, but that is to obscure and occlude the violence which always accompanies revolution, armed violence, and the violence indeed of civil war, which is a part of every major revolution in the modern period also.
I had an idea many years before that perhaps what can be the reason of this change, that from now on there are no civil wars, from now on there are only revolutions. I think the reason is that the thinkers, the writers, the philosophers, the intellectuals of the Enlightenment, because of the Enlightenment, began to believe in progress, began to believe in advancement of humanity. Till the Enlightenment, usually the Golden Age was somewhere in the past. And from the Enlightenment, the Golden Age went into the future. And when people believe in that, well, they can think that, well, perhaps a civil war can serve the progress too. And so to kill 1, 2, 3, 4 or more people for the sake of the progress is not a big price. Do you agree with this?
I agree with half of that. I think it's perhaps too unsubtle to say that the Enlightenment, if we believe in a singular Enlightenment, discovered the idea of progress, but I certainly believe that the future was an invention of Enlightenment thinkers. As you rightly say, until that point, until the 18th century, at least in the West, most thinkers, most of the time, looked to the past for inspiration and orientation in the present. But we can see, beginning in the middle of the 18th century, a movement towards the future. One indication of this is the location of utopias. Most utopias until the middle of the 18th century are located far away in space. Beginning in the middle of the 18th century, utopias begin to be presented as being in the future in time, and I think that is a very important shift in that period. I do think the major discovery of the Enlightenment thinkers, whether it's Adam Smith or Immanuel Kant, for instance, is not progress, but the idea of unintended consequences, that we can never entirely control the outcomes of our actions in the present. Think about the invisible hand, something that works behind the backs of individuals. I think that is one of the lessons of the Enlightenment, and in that context, civil wars themselves may lead to productive outcomes. That was certainly something that Immanuel Kant believed, that human conflict itself and the attempt to overcome human conflict would, for Kant, be the way towards perpetual peace. That is, acknowledging the inevitability of human destructiveness and conflict and seeing in that itself as a motor, through its unintended consequences, of potential, albeit very gradual, progress towards human improvement in the future, which had been discovered, invented indeed, by the Enlightenment thinkers.
These ideas of yours has opened some interesting so-called doors for me. And I think about it that there is always the big question that why did the great revolutions who wanted to liberate humanity, why did they end it with dictatorships and terror? The dictatorship of Cromwell, dictatorship of Bonaparte, dictatorship of Lenin and Stalin, and let's not mention Mao Zedong or Pol Pot. But if we admit that most of the revolutions are really civil wars, we can answer these questions, don't you think? I would answer that in a war, not the most human fighter, not the most humanistic warrior, not the best people will win, but the most violent. Isn't it an explanation to that question, that why did so many revolutions ended with dictatorships and the rule of terror?
I would agree with the morphology, but perhaps not the etiology. That is, I would agree with the narrative of the movement often seen in revolutions towards violence, but not necessarily because we would locate the cause of that in the most violent rising to the top. I think it's often the internal contradictions of revolutions which lead to further conflict themselves and that render people who might otherwise be or hope to be peaceful, necessarily into competence for fundamental values. This is the other side, let us say, of the pluralism which the great thinker Isaiah Berlin insisted upon in moral values, that pluralism does not always lead necessarily to toleration. It can lead just as easily to conflict, as those who espouse what they believe to be fundamental values will inevitably fight over the realization of those values. And I think, as I tried to show in the book, that definitions of civil war are among, or indicators at least, of those fundamental values which lead to destructive conflict, often in the course of revolutions themselves.
Isn't the word revolution, to be a revolutionary, is it the justification, the legitimation of the use of violence and more violence, or is it an exaggeration from my side?
I think it would be an exaggeration in the sense that it's not, again, inevitable that a revolutionary should be violent. It may be necessary to use violent means to effect the overthrow, the revolution in the sense of overturning existing structures and existing political, social, economic arrangements. It's not necessary that that should happen. There can be non-violent revolutions, but I think you are, again, correct, as you said a moment ago, in that in the historical observation that many revolutions have cascaded into violence. I don't think that's a necessary part of revolution, but there's a strong correlation between revolutions and violence, which is also the case in relation to civil war, which is essentially and necessarily violent. So again, what I tried to suggest in the book was that a successful civil war is often, as it were, rebranded retrospectively as a revolution. So the American Revolution, what we now call the American Revolution, was called by combatants on both sides a civil war. Once it was resolved, it becomes known to everyone as the American Revolution. My speculation is that, for example, if the secession of the Confederacy in the United States, or from the United States in the 1860s, had succeeded, we might be talking about the Second American Revolution at that point, as indeed that was language that the Confederacy used at the time, but because it was unsuccessful, we either talk about it as the US Civil War, or as some still call it in the American South, either the war between the states or the late unpleasantness.
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, you have written at the end of your book, civil war is not eternal. Do we have any hope to live sometimes in a world without civil wars?
I believe we do. It was certainly a dispiriting experience to spend many years writing about civil war and the horror of civil war and experiencing that through the eyes of those who had gone through civil war. But I ended up the book with some hope. Why did I have hope after examining 2,000 years of the most destructive form of human interaction? Well, for two reasons. One is that I believe firmly that anything that human beings have invented, they can uninvent. And one of my claims of the book is that civil war was a human invention. It's not a necessary part of our makeup, of our DNA, as it were. It was invented, and it was invented by the Romans. And anything that we can show to have been invented can be uninvented as well. That's the first larger theoretical point almost. The second point is a more empirical one based on recent history. We now have examples of very long-running, very destructive civil wars, which have been brought mostly to peaceful conclusions. The Colombian Civil War in South America, the Sri Lankan Civil War, have been brought to an end. The Balkan Wars were brought to an end. We are beginning to find mechanisms to conclude conflicts that we think of as civil wars. In all of those cases, the settlements are not perfect, but they're much closer to securing peace than any similar mechanisms that we've managed to craft so far in recent human history. So I think that, as Immanuel Kant might say, that is one of the signs of the progress towards enlightenment, even if we haven't quite yet reached enlightenment, in relation to the effort to uninvent, to abolish, to consign to the dustbin of history that particularly human activity and that particularly horrific human activity that we call sometimes civil war.
Thank you very much. And I think we could talk for hours about civil wars, but I want to give the opportunity to the audience. If anybody has any questions, please, it is the time for that. About civil wars, you can answer it, put the question in Hungarian, of course, and I translate it.
And all the answers are in the book, which has been both beautifully translated and beautifully produced as a book, and makes a marvelous gift for your friends and family.
Thank you very much. Also, I was not the translator, but the translator was my ex-student, so it is the same almost as I should have translated it. So I think I have done it. Okay.
I think we have a question here.
Thank you very much.
Please introduce yourself so I can put names to faces.
I will, and I'm sorry, and this is not a question in Hungarian. Rodrigo Ballester, I'm the head of the Center for European Affairs here in MCC, and I'm going to maybe ask you a question about the future. I know it's totally incorrect to ask that to an historian, but in 2018, the Minister for Home Affairs of Emmanuel Macron in France, so a couple of years ago during his first mandate, after 18 months in office, said, I see a risk of a civil war. I see a risk of a civil confrontation in my country, in France. And it's true that there is a fear that might happen actually in other countries with, very high rates of migration, very high rates of unintegrated migrants. With all your knowledge about civil wars of the past, do you think those remarks were exaggerated, or do you think they are grounded? Do you think there is actually a risk of civil war in some countries of Western Europe? And if not, what is basically your guess? Where is going to happen next? Thank you.
Yes, a very important and very urgent question, not just in Western Europe, but also in the United States as well, where similar fears have been expressed. Since I finished the book, this was 4 or 5 years ago, I've been collecting exactly the kind of statements that you quote there, and even that particular statement that you quote from the Macron government. Even though in many cases I believe that those predictions in some senses, or maybe fears about civil war, may be misplaced. There hasn't been a civil war of that kind in France, for instance, thank heaven. I think it is significant when one sees, as it were, an increase in the language of civil war, when one sees expressions of the fear of civil war coming out into the public sphere in that way. Why do I say this? I say this because, even again, going back all the way to the Romans, the Roman historians said that one of the earliest signs of civil war is the language of civil war, is the fear of civil war, is citizens imagining that civil war may come to their otherwise settled and peaceful societies. It's think of it like a seismograph feeling the very first tremors of an earthquake before the earthquake has come, that the rising fear, the rising language of civil war may be one index of deeper social divisions, deeper social discontents. The imagining of the fracturing of society itself can help to lead towards the fracturing of society in different ways. So I think we should take very seriously those expressions, and at the moment, this is not a scientific observation, but it's an anecdotal observation. The increase in the language of the possibility and the imagining of civil war in one of my countries, that is the United States, is genuinely alarming, not only because of the index of social fragmentation that it gives us, but also because that language is occurring in the most heavily armed country in the world. There are more guns than there are people in the United States. And if social division and political division and fragmentation goes deeper in a society where people have access to weapons, are willing to organize, and are willing to imagine violence in a context where they feel threatened, then we are in a very dangerous situation indeed, possibly leading towards something that might look like perhaps localized civil war, certainly not a civil war of the kind that happened in the United States in the 1860s. It's not going to be pitched battles between armies like the pitched battles of Europe in the same period. It will be more episodic, it will be more local, it will be more frightening, I think, because of that. But I do think we should take these statements seriously and ask what fears, what dislocations, and what divisions does the use of this language betoken, and how can we find solutions to prevent that division from becoming deeper, and if it becomes deeper, prevent it from turning into even localized violence, which could set off even more broad-gauge violence as well. So I take these utterances very seriously, and I think they are an impulse towards policy in other areas to prevent those possibilities from becoming, those imaginations from becoming realities. So thank you for that question. It's a very, very urgent one.
Any other questions, please?
Thank you. Kálmán Póca, also from the MCC, head of the Center of Constitutional Politics. Actually, in light of your last remarks, I would be interested in your views on Northern Ireland, actually. As far as the 20th century history is concerned, so it's not the Irish Civil War, which I'm asking about, but it's Northern Ireland, whether a low intensity but violent conflict, is it a civil war or not? And secondly, whether you mentioned the language as a seismograph for a coming civil war. What do you think about that in Northern Ireland? In light of the Brexit and the possible referendum of the unification of Ireland, I didn't really follow Irish newspapers in Northern Ireland, whether this language has changed in the last, I don't know, 10 years or not. But I would be interested in your views on Northern Ireland. So.
Yes, I mean, two very important questions about a very important part of my other country, the United Kingdom. I was in Belfast 3 weeks ago now, and talking to colleagues in politics and law, as well as in history, about exactly these issues, which are very urgent and very much at the front of everyone's minds now, especially in light of the stresses on the Good Friday Agreement, another peace agreement to conclude a case of civil conflict, which so far has been remarkably successful since 1998, but as you know is under threat at the moment because of the unexpected stresses and strains which have come from particular choices that were made about the nature of the Brexit, the exit from the European Union that the United Kingdom would undertake. So these are, again, very urgent questions. To the first one, whether what are called by both sides, or all sides, I should say, in Northern Ireland, the Troubles with a capital T, was that a civil war? If you talk to people in Northern Ireland, if you read reports from the time, particularly from the 1970s and earlier 1980s, yes, people do call it a civil war. If you talk to political scientists, perhaps like yourself, political scientists have a reigning definition of what is a civil war, and a key part of that definition is the number of deaths which take place in a certain period, usually a year. I think it's a threshold of 1,000 battle deaths in the course of a single year. Now, as you'll know very well, no single year in that low-intensity conflict, as you correctly call it, had 1,000 deaths. So according to political scientists who count and accumulate data about civil wars, what happened in Northern Ireland was not a civil war because it never rose to that threshold. But I take it as much more important that the testimony of those who lived through it and who still have memories of that terrible period, that counts for a great deal more. And they did think of it as a civil war because among fellow citizens, okay, divided by religion, by politics, but nonetheless members of the same community and seeing each other as, again, engaged in this intimate enmity, which is what's so frightening about civil war in that sense. The current situation, well, we don't have 3 hours to go through all the ins and outs of Brexit and The announcement just this afternoon by the United Kingdom government that they are on the verge of breaking international law by proposing domestic legislation which will undermine the relevant portions of the UK-EU treaty about Brexit to secure a potential political settlement which will allow the elements of the Ulster Unionist Party that do not wish currently to engage in government to come back into government. Very complex situation, but I think the origins of this can be traced back to the political choices about the particular form of Brexit that Britain undertook, a so-called hard Brexit. And we would not be in this position of having to choose between Brexit on the one hand and the Good Friday Agreement on the other if other choices had been made earlier about the nature of Brexit itself. How does this relating, to take your last part of your question, how does this relate to the possibility of Irish unification? Certainly everyone I talked to in Belfast recently and all the commentators who have been writing about this question recently as well, the indications are that unification will not happen soon. A referendum will not happen soon, mostly for political reasons. There is not political will yet to bring that particular very important question to some kind of debate or resolution through a referendum. However, as you'll know, in the recent elections in Northern Ireland, pro-unionist parties, that is unionist on the island of Ireland, not between Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, the mainland of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, are now in a majority in Northern Ireland. So it makes it conceivable politically for the first time that the question might be asked at some point in the future about whether the 6 counties that now comprise Northern Ireland, the population of those 6 counties might want to reunite with the Republic of Ireland. Now, again, if we take the Brexit example, this is to wrap this up, in the Republic of Ireland, the Irish government was very well prepared ahead of time, both for Brexit and as they'd been prepared in relation to another referendum, the referendum on abortion some years ago. The Irish do their homework and their spade work before engaging in existential questions about the future. The British, I'm sad to say, or at least the British government in recent years, have not had that level of preparation. And if we're going to have a serious debate about Irish reunification, the groundwork has to be laid for that over 10 or possibly 20 years of different forms of questioning, different forms of debate, in order to allow that very important, potentially both divisive and uniting question to be asked. So it should not be asked hastily, because that in itself could lead to conflict. So I think maybe within my lifetime, certainly within your lifetime, you're slightly younger than I think there will be a referendum on Irish unification, but not in the next 10 years would be my guess, but I may be wrong about that. The future is not my period. I'm a historian, but I think we could foresee that certainly in the next 5 years, I would guess not within the next 10 years, but within the next 20 years, I think it's now conceivable there would be a referendum on reunification, yes.
Future is not my period. I like this sentence. It came from one of your colleagues? Okay, it's good. Any other questions, please?
My name is Csaba Lévai. I'm a historian. I am a professor of history at the University of Debrecen here in Hungary. And I have a question about the American Revolution. Of course, you mentioned a few minutes ago that the American Revolution was the first great civil war which was successfully rebranded as a revolution. And unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to read your book, but I checked some of your lectures on YouTube, and in your lecture you delivered in the Law School of the University of Chicago, you mentioned that the American Revolution was a civil war because it was a war within the same single political community of the British Empire, of the North Atlantic. But I wonder, was the American Revolution also a civil war in another sense of the word? Was it a civil war within the political communities of the 13 colonies? What is your opinion?
Very briefly, my opinion is I believe that's correct. And thank you, Shaba, for coming this evening. No one else in the room may know this, but I do want to say that we've had a dialogue about the American Revolution over many years, now in person some years ago, but then in correspondence in the intervening period. So it's a real pleasure to see you again. Thank you for coming, and thank you for asking that wonderful question. But I think, yes, no, in brief, the answer is I believe that's correct. And when you do have a chance to buy the book, and buy many copies of the book to give to your friends and family, you will see that I write about exactly that when contemporaries in the 1770s, for instance, talk about the conflict in North America at that point as a civil war, some of them are referring to it exactly in the terms that you quoted me as talking about, that is, as a conflict. Often they use family language, the family of brother against brother, fratricide, within the community of the British Atlantic Empire. However, other examples, and these are in the book as well, say that within Massachusetts or within New England, we are fighting a civil war. There's a map, I think, from 1775 of Boston. And the caption on the map is "the seat of the Civil War in New England." And I think that's both, that term civil war means both the Roman sense of among fellow citizens, but there's also a more immediate historical sense among the inhabitants of New England in the 1770s, thinking back to Old England in the 1640s, and saying this is a new iteration of the civil wars that were fought in England in the middle of the 17th century, now coming back in their political, ideological, and even religious form in New England, in Boston, in particular locations in the 13 colonies in the 1770s as well. So all of those elements of historical memory are layered into that term civil war, and these are both a multitude of local civil wars in the 13 colonies, as well as an overarching, all-encompassing civil war that takes in Britain, even Ireland, the Caribbean, the 13 colonies, as part of a single conflict within that single community. And so I'll wrap this up by saying one of the lessons of the book is that whenever somebody calls a conflict a civil war, and therefore talks about fellow citizens, we should ask, citizens of which community? What are they telling us about the community, the imagined community, as Benedict Anderson famously put it? What are they telling us about the imagined community which they inhabit? In some cases, it's the imagined community of the British Empire in the 1770s. In other cases, it's the imagined community of Boston, of Massachusetts, of New England. So I think you're absolutely right in that question. Thank you again, and thank you for coming.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Other questions, perhaps? Anybody in English or in Hungarian?
I think I heard the question, where can I buy a copy of this marvelous book? And will you sign it for me? You can buy a copy of the book at the rear of this room, and I will very happily sign it for you.
Thank you very much. You told it instead of me, thank you, in my name. But I didn't want it to make so much reclam, advertisement. Please, anybody? Hannah Arendt. I have read in a study of Hannah Arendt, which is not translated into Hungarian, unfortunately, that about violence. Violence, she admitted that sometimes people need some violence to listen to the voice of moderation. But usually the result of the use of violence is a more violent world. Do you agree with this?
Briefly, yes. I think violence is almost never the answer. and that we need to find better questions if violence does turn out to be the answer in that way. Going back to our discussion about revolution, it's not only revolutions which often descend into violence. When violence has been used as a weapon or a method, it does often lead to spiraling violence in itself, and that is definitely one of the lessons of studying civil war. I think the very first quotation from the book that you gave at the beginning of this session was that observation. It's not my observation, it's the observation of many students of civil war, is that the most likely outcome of a civil war until quite recently was another civil war. That large-scale violence, the wounds it leaves behind, the difficulty of healing those wounds often means those wounds open quickly and lead to further conflict. So violence is never the solution.
Thank you. I'm thinking about after the political changeover in Hungary in 1989, we had a lot of political and other problems, and sometimes people said that you should make a revolution. Why shouldn't you make a revolution? And it was always very strange for me, because behind this question there was a belief that revolutions can solve all of the problems. And I think revolutions are able to make as many problems as they solve. Do you agree with this?
Unintended consequences, again, that great lesson of the Enlightenment. I mean, we have examples of the so-called Velvet revolutions around the same period, which presumably lay behind that encouragement here in Hungary. But we also have the example, for instance, of the Arab Spring, which looked, initially at least in some of its forms, to be revolution in that positive, forward-looking, liberatory sense, but in almost every case in the Middle East, the promises of the Arab Spring have been rolled back or descended into even more destructive forms of violence and repression. So one can never exactly tell what the consequences are going to be when you let the genie of violence out of the bottle.
Thank you very much. Any other questions, please, because I began to talk again, and I would like to give you the word if you have any. Excuse me? Yes, of course. Please, could anybody give him a microphone? Well, I give you a microphone.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you. I have to admit that I haven't yet read this book, but I understood that sort of your thesis is the revolutions are all civil wars to a certain degree, and the revolution as a glorifying term comes after the political change that they engender. My question is sort of historiographical. So how do you see, because on the other side of this spectrum, there are people who tend to see world history in the consequences of revolutions, which are always positive. And how do you see, is it something that is able to be challenged, or after you challenge this, have you received heavy criticism for this viewpoint? Thank you.
On the latter point, I think I would have to say, no, I've not received heavy, perhaps I should receive heavy criticism, and it hasn't come yet, and perhaps it's about to come any moment now from the audience. But no, I think actually it's one of the arguments of the book which has been most immediately taken up, as you may be aware, because you ask a historiographical question. The historical study of revolutions until about 5 or 10 years ago had really fallen asleep. It was very strange. I grew up intellectually, at least, in the 1980s and early 1990s. Before and after 1989, that was a great period of studying revolutions. And then it all went very quiet until about, let's say, 2015, and there's been an upsurge of really serious historical study of individual revolutions, but also, crucially, of comparative revolutions, connected revolutions, the sequence of revolutions. Again, we're in actually a glorious period of the study of revolutions by not just historians, but political scientists and sociologists as well. And I think within that context, my theses about civil war, the sequence of civil wars underlying the sequence of revolutions, the relationship between violence and revolution, which is not my thesis alone, obviously, have been very well received. And so I think they came at the right moment, but also because I was sensitive to some of those changes. As I think Peter mentioned a moment ago, I edited a book about 10 years ago on the global history of revolutions in the so-called Age of Revolutions, and we expanded that conception of the Age of Revolutions back to the middle of the 18th century and forward to 1848 and its consequences in Europe and elsewhere, to have a broader sense of the different kinds of revolutions, not just political revolutions or even social revolutions, but economic revolutions, cultural revolutions, revolutions in production, revolutions of empires, between empires and within empires, revolutions in the human relationship with nature, for instance, the ways in which all of these can be conceived of as revolutions, expanding the category beyond the traditional ones which, for example, Hannah Arendt dealt with in her On Revolution. I think it's becoming a more flexible tool for understanding both major transformations in human history, but also major transformations in the relationship between humans and the non-human world as well. Green revolutions, blue revolutions, as well as pink revolutions and orange revolutions.
Thank you very much. I think we have some time for some very short questions. Please. If not, yes, please. Oh.
Én magyarul kérdeznék civilként. Tehát azt szeretném kérdezni, hogy a polgárháborúkban mi a szerepe a vezetőnek, ugye valószínűleg mindkét oldalon van vezető, politikai vezető is, illetve a katonai vezetőknek milyen szerepük van, és mennyire befolyásolják a polgárháború létrejöttét és alakulását. Ez lenne a kérdésem, mint civil.
Mindannyian civilek vagyunk, köszönöm szépen. The question is that what was the role of the leaders in the civil wars, politically or military?
Forgive me for not answering your question in Hungarian. My Hungarian is very rudimentary. Well, there are many answers that could be given to that question, whether one is talking about the military leaders in civil war, those who stress the war side of civil war, or those who took on the role of political or cultural leadership in those conflicts. That was really not my interest in the book. I'm an intellectual historian. I'm interested in ideas and concepts. So I would say that's a wonderful topic for a book. And if you yourself are a historian or a political scientist, that would be a book on leadership in civil war would be very well worth having, though not one that I would be capable of writing myself, I'm afraid.
May I answer the gentleman in Hungarian short lesson? It's a very good... Nagyon jó a kérdése. Szerintem hatalmas a szerepe a vezetőknek. Arra gondolunk, hogy az amerikai forradalom, amit függetlenségi háborúnak neveztünk, mindegy, ahogy nevezzük, az volt. Hatalmas szerencséjük volt, hogy olyan személy állt az élén, mint George Washington, aki mindent megtett annak érdekében, hogy lemondjon a rá ruházott hatalomról. Washingtont kinevezték egy fél évre diktátorrá a függetlenségi háború 1770-es évek végén, de senki nem vette észre, mert nem viselkedett úgy, mint egy diktátor. És amint a háborúban ez lehetővé vált, visszaadta a hatalmat a képviselőtestületnek. Ugyanakkor más forradalmak, más vezetőinek eszében nem volt visszaadni a hatalmat, sőt, megragadták azt, megtartották, megőrizték. Nem akarok példákat mondani, mindannyian tudjuk, hogy kikre gondolok. Talán nagy jelentőség van annak, hogy egy vezető el akarja kerülni az erőszakot, a diktatúrát, a vérontást, a tömeggyilkosságot rettenetes dolognak tartja, avagy azt mondja, hogy hát ahol vágják az erdőt, ott pattog a forgács, nem lehet omlettet tenni, anélkül, hogy össze ne törnénk a tojásokat, tehát törjünk össze minél több tojást, az omlett persze sose készült el. Tehát nagyon nagy jelentőség van a vezetők személyiségének. szerintem. Köszönöm szépen, ezt szerettem volna mondani. I was talking about George Washington and other leaders of political revolutions.
So you gave a better answer than I did.
Oh,
I don't remember mentioning Washington or dictatorship, but thank you.
I respect George Washington very much. Nagyon tisztelem George Washington. Nagyon szépen köszönjük a részvételüket, és tényleg őszintén ajánlom figyelmükbe a könyvet. Ez nem egy lexikonszerű felsorolása a polgárháborúknak, ez egy elgondolkodtató tanulmány, valamennyiünk számára érdekes következtetésekkel. Úgy tudom, 20% kedvezményen lehet megvásárolni itt a bejáratnál. Köszönöm szépen a figyelmüket!
Megvalósult a magyar kormány támogatásával. Tesztelje tudását a Rubicon Próba online történelmi kvízjátékában. Rubicon-próba.com. Ha tetszett a videó, akkor hasonló tartalmakért iratkozzon fel csatornánkra.